the scientist in the white lab coat becomes a new form of authority. We begin to recognize a person in the white lab coat as someone that has the right to tell us what to do, how to live our lives, what kind of food we should eat, person that can develop new kinds of technologies that governments might benefit from, either in the civilian or the military sphere. And that gets us back to the question of the military sphere. I talked about the Promethean spirit at the beginning of this lecture, how the developments in science and technology could be used on the one hand to broadly benefit society, and how on the other hand that technology could be used to enhance the greed and power of a particular group, or let's say of a state or government. During World War I, which is known as the first total war, where all the resources of society were mobilized against all the other societies that were partaking in that war, every side began hiring scientists, putting them into secret labs to develop new killing technologies. This represents the dark side of the Promethean spirit that I began this lecture with. During World War I in the United States, we had the Chemical Warfare Service, and it developed millions and millions of tons of new kinds of killing chemical agents. This was true also in France, it was true in Russia, in Germany, in Great Britain. You might say World War I was one of the biggest, the hugest boons to the scientific enterprise. It provided a level of employment for scientists in all sorts of new kinds of scientific discoveries. And when the war ended, there was a search on then for applying these new developments in science and technology to the civilian sphere. World War II, this trend continued, whereby scientists were hired by states in order to enhance military effectiveness, the conduct of total war. And you might say that modernity is about who wins, which states are more effective in the modern world are the states that can most effectively mobilize scientific and technological resources. It's therefore no accident that modern states must spend a huge amount of their money, their taxes, on the scientific enterprise, but specifically a scientific enterprise that will have some sort of benefit for that state. Now, during World War II, perhaps the greatest success of a state in mobilizing across the entire nation all of its scientific resources is something called the Manhattan Project. And that was very much connected with total war during World War II. What was the Manhattan Project? It meant gathering together scientists, leading scientists in physics, to develop a nuclear bomb that would then end the war in Japan, and ultimately World War II, and then set the stage for American power following the war, which indeed it did. And one of the characteristics of a nuclear bomb that I think makes it appropriate for the United States to develop it is that it doesn't discriminate. It kills everything. It doesn't go after just military targets. It goes after everything that is located within a particular space. It is the most democratic of all bombs in that sense, and perhaps appropriate, therefore, that the most democratic country should have developed it, and also the country on the leading edge of science and technology, and thus of progress. The Manhattan Project was also a key moment in our course in that it consolidated a new model for doing science and technology, and that is doing it in secret, behind closed doors, without communication between scientists in one country and another. A secret model for doing science rather than an open and collaborative model across national boundaries for doing science. Something very new, and that's with us to this day. The Manhattan Project was a byproduct of a guy named Bombs Away Curtis LeMay, who believed that America will win wars by using its advantage, which is technological and scientific. We have the ability to deploy science and technology far more effectively than our competitors, those that we are at war with, and so we must do that in order to win wars. And that's exactly what Bombs Away Curtis LeMay did. First, as the architect of American bombing campaigns leading to the nuclear bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and then later on as part of the head of Strategic Air Command that urged the use of shock and awe to bomb the shit out of Vietnam and to attempt to try to win the war in Vietnam. He was the model for a very prominent and interesting movie called Dr. Strangelove. And by the way, Dr. Strangelove takes that image of the scientist in the white lab coat who is a hero, but then sees that darker sort of side of the Promethean spirit as part of that interpretation, thus creating the idea of the evil scientist who's going to use this knowledge not to make our lives better, but perhaps to destroy us and to achieve some sort of nefarious goal. With the leap to the hydrogen bomb, rather than splitting the atom, which created tremendous power that fueled the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you would join the atoms together to create a fusion bomb, which is far more powerful than the fission bomb. And the first hydrogen bombs were created in 1953 and 1954 by the United States, and then very shortly after there by the Soviet Union, involving a level of destruction which could easily become global, encompassing the entire globe. As a kind of footnote to this, that also relates back to the theme of Frankenstein, the first test of the hydrogen bomb by the United States in the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific in 1953 and 1954 involved some fallout that happened to fall upon a ship that was known, of all things, as the Lucky Dragon. At the time, this was a worldwide controversy. The ship, the Lucky Dragon, was a Japanese fishing trip. Sort of ironic that the Japanese should be the first victim of the fission bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also the first victims of the first hydrogen bombs, the next iteration of the technology dropped in 1953 and 1954. At any rate, the inhabitants of the Lucky Dragon were fishing, and the fallout from the test dropped onto the boat, and the crew members suffered from extreme radiation sickness, and a couple of them actually died. And by the way, the United States refused to provide information to the Japanese government about the chemical content of that fallout for national security reasons. Again, the secrecy of the whole enterprise. Within Japan itself, you may not know this, but Godzilla was a byproduct of the Lucky Dragon's misfortune of being in the way of the fallout from the American testing of its hydrogen bombs in the Pacific. Godzilla, the movie, Gojira in Japanese, came out in 1954 right after the controversy about the Lucky Dragon. And what Godzilla represented in the mind of the filmmaker was science and technology now inflicting a punishment on humanity, in particular on Japan. What was Godzilla? Godzilla was a combination of an ape and a gorilla. It had been fused together in the radiation and emerged out of, not an ape and a gorilla, I'm sorry, an ape and a whale, and had fused together in the ocean, emerged from the ocean to inflict vengeance upon humanity for its technological and scientific sins. The movie itself, originally, the first Godzilla in 1954, was very much a critique of science and technology, essentially Japan's equivalent of Frankenstein. That is to say, Godzilla represents an extreme concern about science and technology going off in the wrong direction, and far from making our world more secure, actually making it much less secure. And then there's also resonance that I'm having you think about with regard to gender in one of the articles that you are reading about the relationship between the bomb and sex. It is an odd kind of thing that you will think about in the reading on gender and nuclear technology, that women were very much associated with the killing power of this new technology. So, for example, where did the term bikini come from? The French inventor of this new kind of swimming device that women would wear that would show much more flesh was searching for a term for this new bathing suit. At the time, news of the hydrogen bomb test were all across the newspapers of the world, so he figured it would be perfectly appropriate to call this new swimming suit the Bikini, after the Bikini Atoll where the Americans were conducting their hydrogen bomb test. We have many terms in the English language refer to the connection between bombing, killing, and women. We refer to women as bombshells. During World War II, the people who dropped bombs, both nuclear bombs but also more conventional bombs on Japan and Germany, painted figures of scantily clad women on the front of their bombs, on the front of their planes. And what I want you to think about with regard to the article on sex and nuclear technology is what this connection between women and killing technology can tell us. I won't go into that right now. We can have a discussion about that further on the discussion board. The era of the development of ever more lethal killing technology continues on through 1963, when the most powerful bomb ever dropped was dropped in the Arctic by the Soviets. It was called the Tsar bomb. The Tsar bomb. And it was a 53 megaton monster, the largest bomb ever exploded, ever tested. Hundreds of miles away, people suffered third-degree burns as a result of the dropping of this bomb. And that area called New Earth in the Arctic, it still remains one of the most radiated places on Earth.